I often hear GP trainees say, time management is the area I struggle most. Recently, I spoke with a GP trainee who failed the SCA exam. He said to me, I'm okay with data gathering, but clinical management is my weak point. The training would take 8 minutes to elicit a history. And this is a common fear that GP trainees have of missing something out. So they're dwelling in data gathering. Given that clinical management is the most heavily weighted domain, leaving only 4 minutes for clinical management is often insufficient to score well. Every second in the SCA exam counts. In this video, you'll learn how to take a targeted history in less time to give yourself more time to score in clinical management. Let's dive right into the first tip. Curiosity is one of the things that I've observed among the high-performing candidates. When you're curious, when you have a genuine interest in what the patient has to say, then you're going to ask questions that's going to allow you to foster a doctor-patient relationship. If you're not curious and you're just asking questions to get information, you don't want to know more about the patient, then it's going to be an issue in your consultation. So your consultation might become more of an interrogation instead of a conversation that flows between two people. Every patient is on a unique journey, and if you're interested to learn more about this individual, you're going to ask questions that's going to open up the consultation and allow that person to tell you more about what they've been going through, their experience, and by learning through that narrative, it's going to be more rewarding for you. Let me give you an example how to ask a question showing that you're interested. I'm curious to know, tell me more about your experience with this headache, Mr. Smith. So by asking a question where I'm showing that I'm interested, the patient will feel more at ease to tell me their story and share any problems that they've been having with this headache. Tip number 2, timing is everything. How you time your question is important in the way that the consultation progresses. A common pitfall I've observed is that GP trainees ask patients' health agenda too late in data gathering. So if you only learn that the patient is worried about brain cancer at 6 minutes in the consultation, chances are you might have to go back in your data gathering, ask about medical history to exclude relevant red flags, for example, to show that you're assessing for space-occupying lesion. However, if you learn about the patient's health agenda approximately 2 minutes in the consultation, then you can plan your history taking and target your history based on the patient's concern. So you might then ask about these relevant red flags in the consultation without having to go back and forth. So when you're timing how you're asking your question, it's important that you ask the questions in sequence. Another pitfall is asking expectation before asking the patient's idea. So remember, the patient's health agenda consists of idea, concern, expectation in that sequence. So don't make the mistake of asking expectation and then asking the idea. Now, sometimes there might be a patient who comes and tell you about their expectation. So you don't have to be rigid, but it's also good to have a logical sequence of how you're asking your question. Choosing the right moment to ask sensitive question is crucial. So you don't want to ask patient a question that they don't expect. So signpost your question. For example, if a patient is coming with low mood and you're worried about their suicidal ideas and risk of harming themselves, it's important that you know how to ask this question. So good approach would be to ask the patient, when people feel low, they feel like they want to end their life, have you had any thoughts of doing anything to end your life? So you see how you're asking the question in a step approach where you don't just ask the patient, have you been having any thoughts of killing yourself, which is not very sensitive. So when you're asking your question, make sure that you understand how to signpost your question and the timing of the question. Tip number 3 is to balance open question and close-ended question. So in the beginning of the story, you want to favor open-ended question. You want to get the patient's story out and encourage the patient to tell you more about the narrative. So it's important that you ask open-ended question. Question that starts with how, question will start with when. If you're asking closed question or you cut off the patient in the first golden minute, then you might interrupt them, and what happens is that they're going to find it difficult to tell you the story. You might have to ask more questions to get the story, which the patient would have volunteered if you just actively listen after you ask open question. So once you've got the story, Then you can narrow down your history and ask more close questions. When you're asking close questions, it's important that you think about how you're asking your question so that you're progressing the consultation. Let me give you an example of how you ask open-ended question. I can ask a patient, how has this headache affected you? So by asking this question, I relate the question to the symptom that the patient presented and ask the patient about the impact on their life. Commonly, I see GP trainees might ask them, who's at home with you? Which is very formulaic when you're asking it that way. And a better way is to ask a question in context. So you could ask the patient, how has this headache affected your activities? This will help you to understand the problem. And if you want to know whether the patient has got any help at home, you might ask the patient, has there been anybody helping you with this headache? Then they might tell you, oh yeah, I've got my wife who is helping me. So by asking the question in context, then you're going to have a better flow in the consultation. Tip number 4 is to ask insightful question. Remember the GP training I told you before. So a problem in his consultation was that he was asking so many questions and he didn't understand the importance of quality of a question versus quantity. Because you've got only 12 minutes in the consultation, it's really important that you rank your question and understand what are the questions that you need to ask in this consultation to make a safe assessment, and then what are the nice questions to ask. So when you understand that, then you'll be able to ask pertinent question that's going to progress your consultation. Are you feeling anxious about the SCA preparation? Maybe you're not getting constructive feedback, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing. If you're looking for one-to-one support, I'd love to help you. Click the link down in the description below to book a call with me to see how I can help you to pass your exam. So by asking insightful questions, you'll understand what are the things in the case that are the problems and how you're going to manage these problems. But if you ask a bunch of questions and you're having this pressure to keep asking an exhaustive list of questions, this is when you dwell in data gathering. So make sure that in your priming you think about what are the differentials that are relevant. For example, if a patient is a 60-year-old and presenting with headache, then my differentials are going to be different compared to a patient who is 20-year-old presenting with headache. So in a 20-year-old, I might not be worried about giant cell arteritis, whereas in a 60-year-old, I'm going to be worried about giant cell arteritis as a differential. So I need to prime the case and anticipate, based on the patient's demographic, what are the insightful questions to ask to help me to narrow down the diagnosis. So by thinking about the quality of your question and sharpening your question, you're going to find that you're managing to take a targeted history in less time, rather than just keep asking so many questions. So remember the difference between questions you need to ask and the questions that are nice to ask. Because you've only got 12 minutes, it's a time-constrained exam, you need to ask a question that is allowing you to make a safe assessment. There are other questions you could ask if you had an hour, but you don't have to ask them in the context of the SCA exam. Tip number 5 is responding to cue. Asking a question is just the first part of the data gathering process when you're eliciting your history. The second part is listening actively to the patient's response. When the patient is telling you their response, you have to be present and listen actively. A common pitfall is to think about what question should I ask next, but then you're not listening to your patient and you're not registering to what they're saying. This is when you might miss cues. Once you've asked your question, listen attentively to the patient's answer. And if they are actually dropping any cues in their response, make a note of that. You might want to ask a follow-up question. For example, if a patient tells you that my cousin Claire had a brain tumor, that's why I'm worried, then this is a cue for you to ask more and you want to dig more about what's been going on with that cousin, because a patient's experience of a brain tumor is likely to be related to the experience of that cousin. So if you don't know about what's been going on in that story there, then when you manage this case, you're not going to do a good job at managing it. For example, if that cousin died of a brain tumor, then it's going to be very scary for the patient. And if you don't know that, then your management is not going to be personalized. the patient's worries and concern. So when you recognize the cue that the patient is dropping and ask a follow-up question, then you're going to progress in your consultation. It is a bit difficult, especially if you're not that experienced, to understand what is a cue. And this will come with practice and recording your consultation and watching it back to see, oh, here this was a cue, because I didn't actually pick up this cue. Then later the patient asked me a question about this headache. So if you understand how to pick up on these cues, then you'll find that your consultation is going to be flowing naturally. But if you don't actually pick up on these cues, then there might be things you don't understand that might be going on in the consultation, or you might find that in the clinical management it comes back as a question when the patient asking you something. Let me give you an example of cue that patient might drop. My wife was very worried, that's why she booked this appointment for me. So this is a cue that the wife was worried and actually made an appointment for this patient. So because it was the patient's wife who made this appointment, it would be helpful to understand what is a wife's ideas, concern, expectation in that consultation. When you're eliciting your patient's health agenda, you might find that it's also helpful to understand the reason the wife was concerned. But if you did not pick up on that cue about the wife booked this appointment, then you're just asking the patient's health agenda. You might miss an important piece of the puzzle in the consultation. By following these 5 tips, I hope that you take less time in your data gathering and give yourself more time in clinical management. If you want to learn how to structure your clinical management, you might be interested to watch this video in which I go much more detail about the clinical management. Take care everybody, bye bye.